I could feel it brewing inside me for months, a gnawing frustration that clawed at me every time I stepped into the office. Working for a mid-sized event planning company in Saginaw, Michigan, wasn't how I imagined spending my career, but somehow, here I was, a senior planner buried in the chaos of constant deadlines and endless demands. I was good at what I did, and maybe that's what made it worse. They knew they could count on me, so they pushed harder, expected more, and I let them. That morning was the same, except it wasn't. I'd been running on coffee and barely 4 hours of sleep for the past week, trying to pull together the final details of a high-profile conference for some tech giant. The kind of event where everything had to be perfect because one small slip could cost the company a contract worth millions. But honestly, I was running on fumes and they didn't care. Nobody ever cared. The day started with an email from my boss, Karen, that almost made me crush the phone in my hand. She had the nerve to push up the deadline for the event's final logistics plan, demanding it by noon instead of the end of the day. And it wasn't just the change, it was the tone. "Get it done, Jacob, no excuses," she wrote. Like I was some robot she could program to run 24/7. I could feel my blood pressure spike as I stared at the screen, my hands clenching into fists. I managed to keep it together for a few more hours, barely. The team was in a frenzy around me, everyone barking orders, rushing around like headless chickens. But then it happened, the final straw. One of the junior planners messed up the catering order, and instead of the upscale menu we'd promised the client, we were about to deliver something that looked like it came from a fast food joint. Karen didn't even bother asking who was responsible. She pinned it on me. "Jacob, you need to fix this. Now." That was it. I don't remember exactly what I said, but it wasn't professional. My resignation letter might as well have been written right then and there. I walked out of the meeting room, grabbed my coat, and left the office without another word. Let them sort out their own mess for once. By the time I got home, I was still fuming, ready to drown my frustration in a cold beer and maybe punch a hole in the wall for good measure. But as soon as I opened the front door, all those thoughts evaporated. There was a sound, a familiar one but out of place. It was coming from our bedroom. I moved quietly, almost on instinct, my body tensing up. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see inside. And there she was, Fiona, my wife of 3 years, sprawled on the bed, her legs hooked over someone's shoulders. That someone was Frank, Michael's younger brother, and he was pounding into her like an animal. I could barely see, red filling my vision as I took in the scene. Fiona's moans, the rhythm of their bodies. They should have torn me apart, but instead something snapped. I was on him before he even knew what was happening, my hands around his neck, squeezing like I wanted to crush his windpipe. Fiona screamed, but I didn't hear her words. Frank's eyes bulged, his hands clawing at mine as he gasped for air. Fiona tried to pull me off, clawing at my arms, crying out that I'd kill him if I didn't stop. "Let him go, Jacob. Please let him go," she sobbed, her voice finally cutting through the rage. I loosened my grip just enough for him to start coughing, trying to catch his breath. But I wasn't done. "Get the fuck out of my house," I growled, yanking him up by his neck. He stumbled, tripping over himself as I tossed his clothes at him. He didn't even have time to get dressed properly before I was dragging him out, his pants barely hanging onto his hips. I shoved him out the front door, his body slamming against the steps, naked as the day he was born. I wasn't done. I spotted his shoes and jacket by the door, and without a second thought I grabbed them, threw open the door again and chucked them after him. He was struggling to stand, still coughing, but I didn't care. When I came back inside, Fiona was sitting on the bed, trying to pull herself together, clothes haphazardly thrown on. She looked at me, eyes wide and scared, like she wanted to say something. But I didn't let her. "Go to hell," I spat before heading to the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. I needed to wash away the filth, the betrayal, and everything that came with it. So Frank scrambled out of the house. I stood there for a moment, the bathroom door still slightly ajar. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't from the exertion of throwing that piece of shit out. It was from the realization of what I had just walked in on. What the hell just happened? I was almost on autopilot as I went to the sink, splashing water on my face, trying to calm the anger and disbelief gnawing at me. I stared at myself in the mirror, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles turned white. And then all the memories started flooding back. How I ended up in this house in this town with this woman. Michael and I went way back. We'd been best friends since childhood, practically brothers ourselves. Growing up in the same neighborhood, going to the same school, doing everything together. He was always the responsible one, the guy who'd have your back no matter what. I guess that's why I trusted him so much, and why it hit me so hard now. He was the one person I thought I'd never lose. Michael's younger brother, Frank, was 10 years our junior, barely out of high school when we were already starting our lives. Frank had always been the spoiled one, the one who got everything handed to him. Their dad was a self-made millionaire who liked to play favorites. Michael, being the oldest, had to work for everything he had, while Frank, the baby of the family, got showered with money and gifts. Their dad thought giving Frank more money would help him find his way, especially since he was still figuring out what to do with his life at 20. Meanwhile, Michael was in his 30s, fully independent and doing well for himself. I never resented Frank for it, though, at least not until now. And then there's my mother. She's been sick for a while, living out in San Diego. I try to send her money every month for treatment, but it's never enough. I've been stuck here in Michigan, working this dead-end job trying to hold everything together, while Fiona. Christ, what was she even thinking? I guess it's not too hard to figure out. The money. Frank had it and I didn't. And apparently that's all she needed. I went back into the bedroom and flopped down on the bed, my hands behind my head, staring up at the ceiling. I tried to process everything, but my mind was just a blur of anger and disbelief. How did it all fall apart like this? Fiona came into the room, her footsteps soft as she approached the bed. I knew she was going to try to explain herself, to make excuses. Maybe she'd even cry and beg for forgiveness. But I didn't want to hear it. "Jacob," she started, her voice trembling. "Don't," I said, cutting her off. "Just don't." She stopped, standing there for a moment before quietly lying down beside me. I could feel her staring at me, probably hoping I'd say something, anything that might open up a conversation. But I didn't. I wasn't interested in talking. I wasn't interested in anything she had to say. After a while, she turned away, lying there in silence. But I knew she wasn't asleep. Neither of us would be sleeping much tonight. As I lay there, my mind started to clear. I was done. With everything. The job that sucked the life out of me, the wife who had just betrayed me in the worst possible way. And this town that never felt like home. I wasn't even going to waste my time with a divorce right now. I just needed to get out, to leave it all behind and figure out what the hell to do next. I had to get to my mother. She was the only person I could still count on, the only one who mattered. I slept for about 6 hours, my body finally giving in to exhaustion. When I woke up, Fiona was still lying there, her back turned to me. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. I got up quietly and started packing a bag. I didn't need much, just the essentials to get me through the long drive to California. My pickup was old but reliable, and it would get me there. I'd figure out the rest when I arrived. Maybe I'd move in with Mom, maybe not. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here another day. It took me about 40 minutes to get everything together. I made sure to grab the small stash of cash I'd been saving. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Fiona didn't stir as I moved around the room. She probably knew deep down that this was it. I wasn't coming back. Just as I was loading the last bag into the truck, my phone rang. It was Michael, my best friend. At least he had been. "What the hell did you do to my brother, Jacob?" he demanded the moment I answered. "What did I do?" I barked back. "Do you even know what he did?" Michael paused, clearly thrown off by the anger in my voice. "He told me you freaked out because you didn't like the way he was looking at Fiona. He said you just snapped, man." I felt my stomach churn. "That's what he told you? That's the bullshit you believe?" I could barely contain my rage. "He was screwing my wife, Michael. Your fucking brother was in my bed fucking my wife. And you think I just snapped because I didn't like how he looked at her?" There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the wheels turning in Michael's head, trying to piece together what the hell was going on. But I didn't wait for him to respond. "You know what? Forget it," I said, my voice cold. You think whatever you want to think. I'm done. I hung up, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. The conversation hadn't changed anything. Michael was still my best friend, at least I hoped he still was. But this felt like the beginning of the end. Maybe it wasn't the end of our friendship, but it sure as hell was the end of everything else. With that, I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. The road ahead was long, 34 hours or more to San Diego. But at least it was a road that led away from everything behind me. I didn't waste any time. As soon as I hung up on Michael, I fired up the truck and drove away, leaving behind the house, Fiona, and the mess that had become my life. I didn't have a plan beyond getting the hell out of Michigan. The truck's engine rumbled under me, the sound somehow soothing as I drove through the early morning streets, heading for the nearest gas station. The gas station was practically empty, just a couple of cars at the pumps and a tired-looking cashier behind the counter. I filled up the tank, grabbed some snacks and a couple of energy drinks, and got back on the road. The sun was starting to rise, casting long shadows across the empty streets. I didn't even glance back at the house as I merged onto the highway, heading south out of the city. As I drove, the memories started to flood in. How Fiona and I ended up in this place in Saginaw, Michigan. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, but really it was only a few years. We met back in California, where I grew up in San Diego. It was one of those classic stories. I was working at an event in downtown San Diego, and Fiona was one of the guests. She was stunning, with a smile that could light up a room. We hit it off immediately, and within a year we were married. I thought we had it all, a decent life in California, close to my mom and my aunt, who practically raised me after my dad passed away. But Fiona never liked California. She hated the heat, the endless sunshine, said it made her feel like she was baking alive every time she stepped outside. She wanted somewhere cooler, somewhere with seasons, somewhere that wasn't California. It was pure luck, or so I thought at the time, that I inherited my father's old house in Saginaw. He left it to me when he passed, and it had been sitting there empty for years. I figured, why not? It was a fresh start, a way to make Fiona happy, and it wasn't like we had any real ties keeping us in San Diego. So we packed up and moved across the country, leaving behind everything I'd ever known. Moving to Saginaw felt like the right decision back then. The house was paid off, and we had a new place to call home. But I didn't realize how much I'd miss California until it was too late, especially after Mom got sick. She'd been battling her illness for years, and it only got worse after we moved. My aunt, who lived close by, took care of her, but I still felt like a failure, sending money every month and calling as often as I could, but never being there. Flying out wasn't an option most of the time. Too expensive, too much time off work. And driving there had always seemed insane, until now. I drove with the windows down, the cool morning air helping to clear my head. I knew I had to call Aunt Linda, let her know I was coming. She was always the level-headed one, the rock of the family, and I dreaded telling her what had happened. Not yet, though. I needed to at least get out of Michigan first. The road stretched out before me, and I felt a strange sense of freedom. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I didn't know what I'd find when I got to San Diego. I didn't even know how long it would take me to get there. But I had to go. There was nothing left for me in Michigan except a pile of broken promises. As the miles ticked by, I finally worked up the nerve to call Aunt Linda. I pulled over just before crossing into Indiana, the landscape shifting subtly as the lake disappeared from view. She picked up on the second ring. "Jacob, is everything okay?" She sounded worried, like she always did whenever I called out of the blue. "I'm okay, Aunt Linda," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm heading your way. I'm coming to see Mom." There was a pause on the other end. "Now? What happened?" I don't want to get into it over the phone," I replied, glancing out at the empty highway. "I'll explain everything when I get there. Just be ready for a long conversation." "Jacob, you're scaring me. Is Fiona okay?" "She's fine," I said quickly, though the word tasted bitter. "It's not about her. Look, I don't know how long it'll take me to get there. I'm driving and, well, I might get delayed. But I'm coming, I promise." "Okay," she said softly. "We'll be here, Jacob. Just be careful, all right? And call me if you need anything." "I will. Thanks, Aunt Linda." I hung up before she could ask any more questions. I wasn't ready to talk about it, not yet. The pain was still too raw, the betrayal too fresh. I got back on the road, crossing into Indiana. The drive felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream I couldn't wake up from. The landscape changed, the small towns and stretches of farmland slipping by as I kept heading south, following the shore of Lake Michigan. The road was quiet, just me and the occasional trucker making the early morning haul. When I reached Indiana, I took a short break, stretching my legs and grabbing a quick bite to eat at a roadside diner. The place was empty, the waitress barely acknowledging me as I scarfed down a sandwich and coffee. I wasn't hungry, but I needed the energy to keep going. After Indiana, I crossed into Illinois, the outskirts of Chicago looming in the distance. I decided to bypass the city itself, sticking to the quieter roads. The last thing I wanted was to get stuck in traffic or deal with the noise and chaos of the city. I stayed on the highway, heading west on I-80, the miles rolling by in a blur. The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the heartland, leading me away from everything I once knew. The only thing on my mind was getting as far away as possible from the wreckage of my life. About an hour into the drive, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw it was a call from work. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but figured it was better to get it over with. "Jacob, where the hell are you?" It was Karen, my boss, sounding more irritated than usual. "We've got a big day today and you're MIA. The boss wants to talk to you." I could feel the irritation bubbling up again, but I kept my voice calm. "I'm not part of the team anymore, Karen. Don't count on me." "What are you talking about? You can't just leave without notice. You should have filed a resignation or at least informed us." "I'm sorry," I said, though I didn't mean it. "But it's not my problem anymore." Without waiting for a response, I hung up. The phone rang again almost immediately, but I ignored it. They'd figure it out soon enough. I had barely settled back into the drive when the phone rang again. This time it was Fiona. My jaw clenched as I answered. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice trembling, but not with the apology I knew she should be giving. There was something else there, something desperate. "I'm going somewhere you don't belong, Fiona," I replied, my tone flat. "Don't call me again." "Jacob, please, just—" But I hung up before she could finish. The calls kept coming, but I silenced the phone and focused on the road. I wasn't ready to deal with her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. By the time I reached Des Moines, it was early afternoon. I'd been driving for hours, my body aching from the tension and the monotony of the road. I needed a break, so I pulled off at a gas station on the outskirts of the city. The place was quiet, the kind of spot where truckers stop to refuel and grab a quick bite before heading back on the road. As I filled up the tank, I noticed a sleek black Cadillac pull into the station. It wasn't the kind of car you usually saw at a place like this, which caught my attention. I watched as the passenger door swung open, and a woman in a fur coat and high heels was practically shoved out onto the pavement. She stumbled, catching herself against the car, her bright red lipstick standing out starkly against her pale face. She yelled something at the driver, but he didn't even look at her before speeding off, leaving her standing there in a cloud of dust and exhaust. She looked around, clearly at a loss for what to do next. Something about the scene felt off, and despite everything going on in my life, I couldn't just leave her there. I finished filling up the tank and walked over to her. "Are you all right?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. She turned to me, her eyes wide with surprise. It took her a moment before she spoke. I don't know. My husband just dumped me here." "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I really wanted to know. She sighed, looking embarrassed. "We came up from Kansas City for the weekend just to get away. Everything was fine until I found this handbag online. It was beautiful, just the kind of thing I've always wanted, and I kept showing it to him, asking if he'd buy it for me. I guess I was pushing it too much because he got pissed, said I was distracting him while he was driving. We almost got into an accident. He kept telling me to stop, but I didn't listen. Eventually, he just pulled over and threw me out. Can you believe that?" I wasn't sure what to say. She looked desperate and out of place, standing there in a fur coat and high heels at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. "So what now?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaky. "All our money is in his account. He was supposed to pay for everything, and now, I don't even know when he might send me something. I can't hitchhike looking like this. I hesitated, thinking about the road ahead of me. This wasn't part of the plan, but something about leaving her there didn't sit right with me. "I'm heading west," I said, pointing down the highway. "I can give you a lift if you want." Her eyes lit up. "Really? That would be amazing, thank you." She seemed genuinely relieved, which only made me more uneasy. But I nodded and helped her load her small suitcase into the back of the truck. Once she was settled in the passenger seat, I got back behind the wheel and pulled out of the gas station, merging back onto the highway. She was talkative, and within minutes, she was telling me all about herself, how she and her husband met, the life they had in Kansas City, and all the reasons she was furious with him now. It didn't take long to figure out that things hadn't been great between them for a while. She dropped hints that her husband hadn't been satisfying her in bed for some time, making dirty jokes and flirting with me as if it was second nature. I kept my focus on the road, offering polite responses when necessary, but keeping my distance. I wasn't interested, not even close. The wound from Fiona's betrayal was still too fresh, and all I wanted was to get as far away from everything as possible. She didn't seem to notice or care about my lack of enthusiasm, continuing to chatter away as we drove further west. I nodded along, not really listening, my mind still stuck on everything that had happened. It was strange, having someone so close when I felt so distant from the world. But for some reason I couldn't bring myself to leave her behind. Maybe it was because I knew what it felt like to be abandoned. Or maybe I just didn't want to be alone with my thoughts. Either way, I kept driving. By the time we rolled into Kansas City, the sun was setting, casting the streets in a golden glow. The woman, Ashley, as I learned during the last leg of our drive, directed me to a well-to-do neighborhood with neatly trimmed lawns and two-story houses that looked like they belonged on the cover of a real estate magazine. It wasn't the kind of place I expected to be dropping off a woman who'd just been kicked out of a car at a gas station, but nothing about this day had gone as expected. I pulled up in front of what must have been her house, a large, well-maintained place with a broad porch and expensive-looking cars in the driveway. She turned to me with a sweet, almost innocent smile, the kind that made you think butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. "Thanks for the ride," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "He's in for a surprise now, that's for sure. He didn't expect to see me back here tonight." She opened the door and stepped out, her high heels clicking against the pavement. Before she closed the door, she blew me a kiss, that same smile plastered on her face. "I'm Ashley, by the way. Thanks again. You've been a lifesaver." I nodded, unsure of what to say. As she walked up the path to her front door, I had the distinct feeling that whatever was about to go down between her and her husband wasn't going to be pretty. But that wasn't my problem. I'd done my part, and now I needed to find a place to rest. I drove around the city for a while, finally finding a modest hostel on the edge of town. It was nothing special, just a place to lay my head for the night. I checked in, grabbed a quick bite from a vending machine in the lobby, and made my way to the small, sparse room. The bed looked inviting, and my body ached from the long hours on the road. But just as I was about to drift off, my phone rang again. It was Fiona. I sighed, knowing I had to answer. She was crying, her voice shaky and desperate. "Jacob, where did you go? Are you okay? Please just tell me you're okay." Everything inside me wanted to lash out, to tell her exactly what I thought of her and Frank. But I kept my voice steady, cold even. "I'm more than okay, Fiona. You don't have to worry about me anymore. You can be with Frank now without a twinge of conscience." There was a pause, and then her voice came through again, softer, almost broken. "Why are you going to see your mom?" I hesitated, wondering how much she knew or guessed. "What makes you ask that?" I finally replied. "You once said you were fed up with everything here," she said, her words coming in a rush. "You said you wanted to go to her to leave all this behind." "Well," I said, my tone flat, "I guess I finally got fed up enough." She was silent for a moment, and then just before hanging up, she spat out, "Fine, go to hell, Jacob." The line went dead, and I stared at the ceiling, feeling oddly numb. After a few minutes, I dialed Aunt Linda, needing to hear a familiar voice. She answered quickly, her tone filled with concern. "I'm in Kansas City right now," I told her, keeping my voice calm. "Just stopped for the night. Everything's fine. You sure, Jacob? She asked, clearly not buying it. Yeah, I'll be there soon, I promise. All right, she said softly. Just be careful. And remember, you don't have to go through this alone. Thanks, Aunt Linda, I said, ending the call before she could ask any more questions. I wasn't ready to talk about Fiona or what I'd just walked away from. Not yet. As I finally settled into bed, the phone buzzed again. This time it was Michael. I almost ignored it, but something told me to pick up. Jacob, he started, his voice tired but sincere. I've been thinking. I think I believe you about Frank. I've noticed him acting weird around Fiona, and she's been a wreck ever since you left. She keeps crying, and whenever he tries to cheer her up, she just pushes him away. She's acting like she's lost everything. I didn't know what to say. Hearing this from Michael, of all people, stirred up emotions I wasn't prepared to deal with. Where are you headed, man? He asked finally. I'm going to see my mom, I replied simply. There was a pause, and then Michael sighed. I get it. Take care of yourself, Jacob, and don't worry. I won't tell anyone where you're going. Just be safe. Thanks, Michael, I said, feeling a weight lift slightly off my chest. You too. At this point, I hung up and fell asleep. The next day, after a quick shower, I decided to take a short walk around the neighborhood before checking out. Kansas City was a far cry from Saginaw, but it had its own charm. The air was crisp, and the streets were just starting to come alive with morning activity. It gave me a moment to clear my head before hitting the road again. Back at the hostel, I gathered my things, checked out, and got back into my truck. My new route would take me toward Oklahoma, a change in direction that felt right somehow. I'd drive for a while, see where the road took me, and then decide my next move. Maybe things would become clearer once I reached my mom's place in San Diego. The first hour of the drive was peaceful, the landscape gradually shifting as I headed further south. The flat, sprawling fields of Kansas were a stark contrast to the green, wooded areas I'd left behind in Michigan. The sky seemed bigger out here, stretching endlessly above the open road. It was easy to get lost in the rhythm of the drive, the hum of the tires on the asphalt, and the steady pulse of the engine. As I approached Wichita, I noticed a young couple on the side of the road, thumbs out, trying to hitch a ride. They couldn't have been more than 19 years old, which caught my attention. Something about their situation didn't sit right with me, so I pulled over to stretch my legs and see what their story was. I got out of the truck and they approached, looking both hopeful and wary. The girl introduced herself as Lucy, and the guy was Arthur. They seemed polite enough, though there was a hint of desperation in their eyes. "What's going on?" I asked, leaning against the truck. They exchanged a quick glance before Arthur started talking. He told me how they'd known each other since preschool, though they weren't exactly friends back then. But when they turned 14, something changed. Arthur confessed to Lucy that he liked her, and to his surprise, she felt the same way. That's when everything started to go downhill. "Our parents were never thrilled about us being together," Arthur explained, his voice tinged with frustration. "My parents didn't like Lucy because she's Mexican. They're old-fashioned, stuck in their ways, you know? And Lucy's parents didn't think I was good enough for her. They wanted her to be with someone, stronger, I guess. Someone who could be a man for the family. Whatever that means." Lucy nodded, her expression darkening as she took over the story. "It got worse over time. They started giving us ultimatums, telling us we had to break up or else. We didn't listen, so they kicked us out. Both our families, just like that." I stared at them, trying to wrap my head around the cruelty of it. "Good God, what kind of parents are those?" I muttered, more to myself than to them. Arthur shrugged, his face set in a determined frown. "We decided to stick together no matter what. We've been trying to get to Oklahoma City. My cousin lives there. She said she'd take us in, but she doesn't have a car, so we've been hitchhiking." They looked at me, hopeful and a little desperate, waiting for my response. I knew that if I went through Oklahoma City, it would add an extra hour to my drive, maybe more. But the thought of leaving these kids stranded didn't sit right with me. "All right," I said, pushing off from the truck. "I'll take you there. It's out of my way, but it's better than leaving you here on the side of the road." Their faces lit up with relief, and they quickly grabbed their bags, climbing into the back seat of the truck. As we got back on the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them sitting close, Lucy's hand resting on the seat, Arthur's palm on top of hers. They looked at each other with a kind of intensity that surprised me. The drive continued smoothly, the miles ticking by as we headed south. I asked them for more details, curious to know how things had gotten so bad between them and their families. Arthur was more than willing to talk, his words coming out in a rush as he recounted their story. "We met when we were kids playing on the playground," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "We went to the same school but were in different classes. We didn't become friends until middle school. Everything seemed fine at first. No one objected to us being friends. But when I told Lucy I liked her, everything changed." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "My parents were furious. They couldn't believe I wanted to date someone who wasn't like us. And Lucy's parents, well, they didn't think I was capable of taking care of her. I'm kind of a nerd, you know? I'm into books and computers, not exactly the tough guy they wanted for their daughter." Lucy chimed in, her voice soft but firm. "It didn't matter to us. We wanted to be together, no matter what. But the more we fought to stay together, the more our parents lost it. They thought they could scare us into breaking up, but all it did was push us closer. In the end, they couldn't handle it, so they kicked us out." I listened, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. How could anyone be so blind, so cruel? These kids were doing everything they could to hold on to what they had, and their parents had tried to tear it apart. As we drove further south, the landscape continued to change, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills and clusters of trees. The sky was a brilliant blue, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a beautiful day, but the weight of the story I just heard hung heavy in the air. "We're almost there," I said after a while, glancing at the GPS. "Oklahoma City's not far now." Arthur and Lucy nodded, their hands still intertwined, their resolve evident in their eyes. After about 5 hours on the road, we finally reached Oklahoma City. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the highway. Arthur called his cousin as we approached the city. She was excited to hear from him and told him to come straight to her house. It wasn't long before we pulled up to a modest, cozy home on a quiet street. The door opened and a woman in her mid-20s rushed out, a wide smile on her face. She ran straight to Arthur, hugging him tightly, then turned to Lucy, embracing her warmly even though it was clear they had never met before. "Thank you so much for bringing them here," she said, turning to me with genuine gratitude in her eyes. "I don't know what they would have done without you." I shook my head, feeling a bit uncomfortable with the praise. "It's no problem. I'm just glad they're safe now." She invited me inside, insisting that I join them for dinner, but I declined. "I appreciate the offer, but I've got to keep moving. There's still a long way for me to go." Arthur stepped forward, shaking my hand firmly. "Thank you, Jacob, really. We owe you one." Lucy smiled, nodding in agreement. "We're going to be okay thanks to you." I set my GPS for a new route, one that would take me through Texas and into New Mexico, skirting the edge of Albuquerque. But peace didn't last long. About an hour into the drive, my phone rang. It was Fiona. I debated ignoring it, but something inside me said I needed to answer. Maybe it was the part of me that still hadn't completely let go. "Jacob," she started, her voice colder than before. "I haven't filed for divorce yet." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my jaw clenching. "Why the hell not? What's left to discuss?" "Because," she continued, ignoring my question, "I'm hoping you'll come to your senses and come back. We can work this out, Jacob. We've been through too much to throw it all away." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything, she still thought there was something to salvage. "You think I'm just going to forget what you did? That I'm going to come back and play house with you and Frank?" There was a pause, then she spoke again, her voice sharp. "This isn't just about us, Jacob. Think about it. You leave, and what happens to everything we built together?" I shook my head, unable to understand how she could twist things so easily. "Fiona, it already is too late. You made sure of that." She sighed, and I could almost hear her rolling her eyes. "Fine, go then. You are a heartless piece of crap." I hung up, the rage boiling over inside me. Call me heartless when she cheated on me. As the miles flew by, the landscape began to change again. The flat plains of Oklahoma gave way to the wide open spaces of Texas, the road stretching out endlessly in front of me. By the time I reached Amarillo, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. I checked in, grabbed the key, and headed to my room. The place was simple, just a bed, a small table, and a bathroom. It was enough. As I unlocked the door, I noticed the faint sound of a TV coming from the neighboring room, which shared a door with mine. Seemed like I wasn't the only one stopping here tonight. After tossing my bag on the bed, I heard a knock on the adjoining door. A man, probably in his late 40s, stood there when I opened it. He had a weathered look, the kind that comes from too much time on the road and not enough sleep. His clothes were dusty, and he looked like he'd been driving as long as I had. "Mind if I come in for a bit?" he asked, his voice gruff but polite. "Just need some company before I turn in." I nodded, figuring it couldn't hurt to talk to someone who wasn't trying to guilt-trip me into coming back. He walked in, the door closing behind him with a soft click. We sat down at the small table, and he introduced himself as Tom. He was headed west like me, but his journey had started all the way back in Tennessee. He was on his way to Arizona to visit his daughter, who'd just had a baby. He hadn't seen her in years, he said, but when he got the call, he knew he had to make the trip. "Life's too short," he muttered, taking a sip from a flask he pulled from his jacket. "Too short to hold grudges or stay in one place too long. So, here I am." I told him about my own trip, keeping the details vague. I mentioned that I was heading to see my mom in California and that I'd left behind some things that weren't worth holding on to. Tom listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally as if he understood exactly where I was coming from. "Funny how life works," he said after a while. "We spend so much time trying to build something, but sometimes the best thing you can do is just let it go and move on." We talked for a bit longer, sharing stories of the road and the places we'd been. Eventually, Tom stood up, stretching his back with a groan. "I'd better get some sleep. Long drive ahead tomorrow." He paused at the door, turning back to me. "Good luck, Jacob. Hope you find what you're looking for out there." "Thanks, Tom," I replied. "Safe travels." He nodded and left. I woke up early the next morning feeling more rested than I had in days. Tom's words from the night before lingered in my mind, but I didn't dwell on them. I checked out of the motel and headed straight to my truck, the engine roaring to life as I pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. The morning was cool, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon as I sped down the open road. I called Aunt Linda, letting her know I was on my way to New Mexico. She sounded relieved to hear from me, reminding me to drive safe and take my time. I promised I would, though part of me was eager to get there as quickly as possible. I pushed the truck hard, eager to put Texas behind me and cross into New Mexico. The landscape changed again, the flat plains giving way to the rocky, sun-baked terrain of the desert. Albuquerque wasn't far now, and the highway led me straight into the heart of the city. The traffic was heavier than I'd expected, and I found myself stuck in a jam, inching forward at a frustratingly slow pace. I hadn't planned on stopping in Albuquerque, but the navigator took me through the middle of the city and I had no choice but to wait it out. Eventually, I made it out of the city, the traffic thinning as I left the urban sprawl behind. The desert stretched out in front of me, vast and empty, the road cutting through it like a black ribbon. I was just starting to relax when I saw her, standing on the side of the road, thumb out, hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere. I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down the window. She approached the truck, her face flushed from the heat. She was in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, with long brown hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her clothes were dusty, and she looked like she'd been out there for a while. "Where are you heading?" I asked. "San Diego," she replied, a note of frustration in her voice. "But I'm in a bit of a tough spot." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "What kind of tough spot?" She hesitated, then sighed. "My car broke down about 50 miles back. I was trying to make it to San Diego to stay with some friends, but now I'm stuck. I've been trying to hitch a ride all day." San Diego was my destination too, so it wasn't an issue to give her a lift. Besides, I could use some company after the miles of solitude. "Well, I'm heading that way myself," I said. Hop in. Her eyes lit up with relief and she nodded quickly. Thank you, I'm Megan, by the way. Jacob, I replied. Hop in. She climbed into the passenger seat and we got back on the road, the desert stretching out endlessly before us. As we drove, Megan started to open up, telling me about how she ended up in this situation. She was originally from Colorado, and she'd been traveling around the Southwest, trying to figure out her next move. This time she was supposed to meet up with some friends in San Diego, but her car had other plans. It's been a rough few months, she admitted. I've been trying to get back on my feet, but things keep falling apart. You know how it is. I nodded, understanding more than I cared to admit. We continued talking as the miles slipped by, the conversation easy and light. Megan had a way of making the hours fly by, her stories filled with humor and a touch of sarcasm that made the drive more enjoyable than I'd expected. By the time we crossed into Arizona, the sun was starting to set, the sky painted with shades of orange and pink. We rolled into Phoenix as night began to fall, the city lights flickering on as we entered the outskirts. I decided to find a decent hotel for the night, figuring we both could use a break from the road. When I pulled into the parking lot of a mid-range hotel, Megan looked over at me, her expression grateful. Thanks for stopping here. I wasn't sure where I'd end up tonight. No problem, I said, shutting off the engine. You've been good company on the road. We went inside and I booked a room for the night, deciding on something a bit more comfortable than the hostels or motels I'd been staying in. Megan offered to share a room to save money, and I didn't see any harm in it. We both needed rest, and it wasn't like I was planning on anything happening. But as the night wore on, something shifted. We talked more, shared more about our lives, and the conversation took on a different tone. Megan was charming, witty, and before I knew it, the distance I'd been keeping started to close. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, or maybe it was the fact that I'd been running from my past for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to connect with someone. One thing led to another, and by the time we made it to bed, things had changed. We didn't bother with the separate beds. We ended up together, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't just running away. I was moving forward. The night was something I hadn't expected, but it felt right. In the morning, we packed up and hit the road again, heading towards California. Megan seemed different too, more at ease, and so was I. The drive through Arizona was calm, the desert stretching out on both sides of the highway. As we approached the California border, I could see the faint outline of Mexico to the left. The thought of crossing into California filled me with a strange mix of anticipation and unease. I hadn't been home in so long, and now I was returning under the worst possible circumstances. I called Aunt Linda again, letting her know we were only a couple of hours away. She was thrilled, her voice bubbling with excitement. She'd been looking forward to my arrival, and now, with the end of the journey in sight, it was starting to feel real. Megan and I talked more as we drove, the conversation flowing easily. I told her about why I was heading to San Diego, about my mom, her illness, and the mess I'd left behind in Michigan. She listened, nodding thoughtfully, and then shared some of her own story. She'd never been married, she said, only had a series of relationships that never quite worked out. Trust had always been an issue for her, something she never really found with anyone. As we passed a sign welcoming us to California, the landscape began to shift once again. The air felt different, more humid, the scent of the ocean drifting in as we neared the coast. By the time we hit the outskirts of San Diego, it was around 3 p.m. The city sprawled out before us, familiar and yet distant. When we crossed under a banner that read San Diego, Megan asked if I could drop her off downtown, where her friends were waiting for her. I agreed, taking the exit that led us into the heart of the city. The streets were busy, but not overwhelmingly so, and it didn't take long to find the address she'd given me. We pulled up in front of a small cafe where a group of people were gathered, chatting and laughing. Megan turned to me, a small smile on her face. Thanks for the ride, Jacob, and for everything else. We exchanged numbers, promising to keep in touch, though I wasn't sure if we actually would. She leaned in, giving me a quick hug before grabbing her bag and heading towards her friends. I watched her go, then pulled back onto the street, heading towards the outskirts where my mom's house was. The drive through the familiar neighborhoods was surreal. Nothing much had changed, yet everything felt different. The closer I got to my mom's house, the tighter the knot in my stomach became. I wasn't sure how she'd react when she saw me, or what I'd even say to her after everything that had happened. But all those thoughts screeched to a halt when I turned the corner onto my mom's street and saw a figure standing on the front porch. As I got closer, the figure came into focus, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. It was Fiona. I pulled up in the driveway, the engine still running as I stared at her in disbelief. Finally, I turned off the truck and stepped out. "What are you doing here? How did you even get here?" "Frank gave me money for the ticket," she replied coolly. "I got here last night." I felt a wave of anger and confusion. "So you flew all the way out here to see my mom? How is she?" Fiona's expression didn't change. "I didn't go in. I stayed at a hotel. I wanted to go in with you." I shook my head, the frustration boiling over. "Do whatever you want, Fiona, but I'm done. I'm not going to be with you anymore." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked up the steps, pushing past her and into the house. The familiar scent of home hit me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I was finally here. I was home. But the tension from Fiona's presence followed me inside, lingering like a bad taste. I walked through the quiet house looking for my mom. She was in the living room, sitting in her favorite chair, a blanket draped over her legs. Her face lit up when she saw me, and she reached out a hand, her eyes filled with warmth and love. "Jacob," she said softly, her voice weak but full of affection. "You're here." "Yeah, Mom, I'm here," I replied, taking her hand and squeezing it gently. We talked for a while, catching up on everything that had happened since I last visited. She didn't ask about Fiona, and I didn't bring it up. There would be time for those conversations later. Right now, all that mattered was that I was here, with her. After a while, I heard the door creak open, and Fiona walked in, looking uncertain. My mom glanced at her, then back at me, understanding immediately what was happening. She didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, as if giving me permission to handle things however I needed to. I stood up and walked over to Fiona, my voice firm but calm. "You need to go." Fiona stared at me, her eyes searching mine for any sign of softness, but there was none. "Jacob, please." "No," I cut her off. "I meant what I said. I'm done. This is my family and I'm going to take care of them. You've made your choices and I've made mine. There's nothing left for us." She looked like she wanted to argue, but then her shoulders slumped in defeat. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the house. As she left, I made up my mind. I was going to stay in San Diego and help my mom. The job hunt wasn't going to be easy, but I'd figure it out. As I settled into the routine of caring for my mom, I couldn't shake the thought of Fiona's sudden appearance. What the hell had she been thinking? Did she really believe I'd forgive her and everything would go back to normal? A few days later, I decided I needed to confront her one last time. I didn't want any lingering doubts or unfinished business hanging over me. I picked her up from the hotel and drove her to the spot where we'd first met, a quiet little cafe near the beach. We stood there for a moment, neither of us saying a word. The ocean breeze tugged at her hair, and I could see the same old frustration in her eyes. "Why did you come here, Fiona?" I asked, my voice steady. "What did you think was going to happen?" She didn't answer, just stared at me with those angry eyes, the same look she'd had when I told her to leave. "You can file for divorce if you want," I continued. "Go back to Michigan. I'm staying here. This is my home now." She didn't cry or plead like I half expected. Instead, she just turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps firm. I watched her until she disappeared around the corner, and that was that. A few days later, I heard from Aunt Linda that Fiona had flown back to Michigan, probably on Frank's dime. Good riddance. One afternoon, a few weeks after everything had settled down, my phone rang. It was Arthur. He thanked me again for the ride to Oklahoma City, telling me that things were going well for him and Lucy. Then he mentioned something unexpected. "By the way," he added with a chuckle, "my cousin's been talking about you nonstop. You know, the one you dropped us off with? She only saw you for a few minutes, but she can't seem to get you out of her head. She keeps bringing you up. I think she's got a thing for you, man. If you ever find yourself back in Oklahoma, you should give her a call. You'd make her day. I'll give her number." The idea surprised me, but I couldn't help but laugh. It was flattering, even if it was just a few minutes we'd shared. I'll keep that in mind, Arthur. Thanks. A few days later, I got another call, this time from Ashley. She'd found my number thanks to a little habit I had, keeping a piece of paper with my phone number in the glove compartment of my truck, right near the steering wheel. I'd started doing it years ago, mainly because I drove a big pickup, and I always worried that if I blocked someone's driveway while parking, they'd need a way to reach me, especially in case I wasn't around when it happened. Jacob, she said, her voice carrying a mix of relief and something else. I wanted to thank you again for that ride. It turns out my husband was cheating on me. I'm glad I found out, but it still stings. I'm sorry to hear that, I replied, genuinely feeling for her. Don't be, she said, her tone shifting to something lighter. I'm better off without him. And I've been thinking about you. I wouldn't mind seeing you again, you know. Maybe we could. Catch up? I have some ideas on how I could properly thank you. The idea wasn't unappealing, not at all. Maybe we could arrange something, I said, leaving it open-ended. We'll see. Take your time, she replied, almost as if she'd read my thoughts, but don't take too long. One day, just as I was getting ready to head out for work, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw a name I hadn't expected. Megan. We hadn't spoken since that night in Phoenix when we'd shared more than just a room. I answered, curious to hear what she had to say. Hey, Jacob, she said, her voice warm and familiar. How's San Diego treating you? Can't complain, I replied. I've got a job, a place to stay. Things are looking up. Good to hear, she said. There was a brief pause before she continued. I'm staying here in San Diego for now. Thought it might be nice to catch up, maybe grab a drink. Where are you staying? I asked. Not far from where you dropped me off downtown. There's a little bar nearby that I like. How about we meet there? I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. It had been a while since I'd looked forward to something like this. Sounds perfect. See you. I quickly got dressed, pulling on a clean shirt and jeans, and headed out the door.